Early morning, May 28, 1941. Eleusis airfield. Outside Athens, Greece. The Mediterranean sun was beginning to climb above the dry limestone ridges, casting a golden wash across a landscape trembling with the sound of engines. The air was thick with aviation fuel, engine oil, and the sweat of tens of thousands of men preparing for an expedition unlike anything in the history of warfare. General Kurt Student, commander of the 11th Air Corps, stood on the observation platform gazing down at the dust-choked runway. Spread out beneath him was an armada of 493 Junkers Ju-52 transport aircraft and more than 70 DFS-230 gliders. The three-engined transports with their distinctive corrugated aluminium skin stretched in endless rows wing to wing, engines ticking over in a mechanical symphony of power and menace. Student was not merely a general. He was a visionary. A pioneer who had spent years building something that had never existed before. He was the father of the German airborne forces. In the First World War he had been a fighter pilot. In this war he had convinced Adolf Hitler that the future of combat lay not in the mud of trenches but in the sky, that soldiers descending from the clouds could seize any fortress and overcome any obstacle without the need for naval landings or prolonged ground campaigns. His target was the island of Crete, sitting astride the eastern Mediterranean like an unsinkable aircraft carrier. Crete was a prize of enormous strategic value. If Germany controlled it, the eastern sea lanes would be locked shut, the Suez Canal directly threatened, and the Middle Eastern oil fields brought within reach. If Britain held it, RAF bombers could strike the Ploiești oil fields in Romania, the single most critical fuel source keeping the German war machine running. Student's plan carried the codename Operation Mercury. It would be the first and largest purely airborne invasion in history. He intended to drop 22,000 of the Reich's finest paratroopers onto the island. No tanks. No heavy artillery. No naval landing craft in support. Just men and silk parachutes. Student placed absolute faith in the element of surprise. The intelligence reports from the Abwehr sitting on his desk painted an extraordinarily optimistic picture. German intelligence estimated that Crete was defended by no more than 5,000 to 6,000 demoralized British and Greek troops, remnants who had fled the Greek mainland just weeks earlier. Stripped of heavy weapons. Broken in spirit. Wanting nothing more than to go home. The Abwehr further reported that the Cretan civilian population was sympathetically inclined toward Germany and would welcome the Wehrmacht as liberators from British imperial rule. Based on this information, Student designed an attack plan that was bold to the point of recklessness. He would drop his forces directly onto the foremost critical points on the island, Maleme airfield in the west, Prison Valley near Hanya, the town of Rethymno and the capital Heraklion in the east. He wanted the airfields captured on the first day so that transport aircraft could land and deliver reinforcements. "We will arrive like a storm," Student told his officers in the final briefing. "And we will win before the enemy has time to reload." But Student, for all his brilliance and experience, had made a fatal error, an error built on arrogance and catastrophically bad intelligence. He did not know that on the other side of the sea, General Bernard Freyberg of New Zealand was waiting for him. And Freyberg did not have 5,000 men. He had more than 40,000 British, Australian, New Zealand, and Greek troops. They were not demoralized. They were angry and hungry for revenge after the humiliation in Greece. Most critically of all, Freyberg knew exactly what Student was going to do. You're listening to Classified Dossiers on the World War II Dossiers-Podcast. New episodes are released daily at 11 a.m. Hit subscribe and leave a like right now. It helps these important historical stories reach a wider audience. To understand the catastrophe about to unfold, we need to look deeper into the strategic context and the intelligence war of 1941, the silent duel between British codebreakers and German overconfidence. Nazi Germany entered Operation Mercury with an unbroken record of airborne success. German paratroopers had seized the Belgian fortress of Eben-Emael in a matter of hours in 1940. blowing open the road into Western Europe. They had jumped onto the Corinth Canal and captured critical bridges before the defenders could react. These easy victories had created an illusion of invincibility. Student genuinely believed that the mere appearance of paratroopers in the sky would collapse enemy morale. What Student did not know was that his opponent held a secret weapon more powerful than any bomb or bullet: information. At Bletchley Park in England, mathematicians and linguists had successfully broken the Luftwaffe's Enigma encryption system. They were reading every order, every report, every operational detail that Student transmitted. Prime Minister Winston Churchill had forwarded this intelligence directly to General Freyberg on Crete. Freyberg knew precisely where the Germans would drop. He knew the 7th Airborne Division would attack Maleme and Hanyar. He knew the gliders would land in the dry riverbed of the Tavronitis. This knowledge allowed Freyberg to position his forces with surgical precision. Instead of spreading his troops thinly along the coastline in a conventional anti-invasion deployment, he concentrated them around the airfields. He transformed those airfields into killing grounds. At Maleme Airfield, the hottest point of the coming battle, Colonel L.W. Andrew of the New Zealand 22nd Battalion had his men dig carefully camouflaged fighting positions right alongside the runway. The 40mm Bofors anti-aircraft guns and 20mm Oerlikon cannon were hidden beneath olive branches and netting. They were ordered to maintain absolute silence, not to fire at reconnaissance aircraft or preliminary bombing raids, saving every round for the paratroopers themselves. The German paratroopers meanwhile knew nothing of what awaited them. They had been briefed that resistance would be light. They carried only personal weapons, submachine guns and pistols. Heavy weapons including machine guns and mortars were dropped separately in supply canisters suspended beneath their own parachutes. This was a fatal flaw in German airborne doctrine. The individual paratrooper touched the ground armed with nothing more than a sidearm and perhaps a knife. He then had to locate his weapon canister somewhere on the battlefield, a canister that might have drifted hundreds of meters from his landing point, or might have landed directly in the lap of the enemy. In those first seconds after landing, a German paratrooper was nearly defenseless against concentrated ground fire. Student believed the Luftwaffe would sweep the landing zones clean before his men arrived. Hundreds of Stuka dive bombers and Bf-109 fighters had attacked the British anti-aircraft positions in the hours before the drop. But Freyberg's camouflage discipline had been superb. The bombing raids were far less effective than the Germans assumed. The Bofors guns remained intact. Their cold barrels pointed at the sky, waiting. On the morning of May 20 the sky over Crete shook with the roar of 1,000 engines. New Zealand, Australian, and British soldiers lay motionless in their fighting holes, fingers tight on triggers. They watched the Ju-52s lumber overhead, slow, low, and impossibly vulnerable. When the first parachutes blossomed open, white flowers against the blue Mediterranean sky, a single command traveled down the British field telephone network: fire. Thousands of weapons opened up simultaneously. Now let us return to the skies above Maleme, where German paratroopers were hanging in the air, helpless, watching streams of tracer fire rising toward them like rain falling in reverse. The brutality of modern warfare does not reside in individual courage. It resides in the efficiency of weapons systems. At Crete the German paratroopers encountered an industrial variable they had not anticipated: high-density low-altitude anti-aircraft fire. The British had equipped the Crete garrison with large numbers of Bofors 40mm guns and Vickers heavy machine guns. The Bofors 40mm was a Swedish-design masterpiece of mechanical engineering capable of firing 120 rounds per minute with explosive fragmentation shells of devastating lethality. When directed against transport aircraft flying low and slow at parachute drop speed, roughly 160 km per hour, the effect was equivalent to swinging a sledgehammer at an eggshell. The Ju-52s at drop altitude were virtually stationary targets against the sky. British anti-aircraft gunners did not need to aim with particular care. They simply held the trigger down and swept the barrel along the formation. The consequences were catastrophic and immediate. Dozens of aircraft were hit and caught fire in midair. Several broke apart, plunging to earth with their full complement of paratroopers still inside, men who never had the chance to jump. Others took rounds through their fuel tanks and transformed into enormous fireballs, incinerating the soldiers standing at the door waiting for the green light. But those who made it out of the aircraft fared little better. A German paratrooper under his canopy was a completely helpless target. He hung in the air for roughly 10 to 15 seconds during his descent. In that interval he became a living shooting gallery target for thousands of infantry rifles and machine guns on the ground below. New Zealand soldiers at Maleme described the scene afterward as shooting ducks. They aimed at the descending figures methodically, picking them off one by one. Many German paratroopers were dead before their boots touched earth. Their blood soaked through the white silk of their parachutes, turning them into red shrouds drifting down from a blue sky. Those fortunate enough to land alive faced a different nightmare. They had no weapons. The German system of dropping arms in separate canisters had backfired disastrously. The weapon containers were scattered across the landscape and many had landed directly inside British and New Zealand positions. German paratroopers carried only P-08 pistols and fighting knives. They had to sprint through open ground under concentrated fire to reach their weapon canisters. Many died with their hands on the canister latches, killed in the act of trying to arm themselves. In the Prison Valley sector, Colonel Heydrich's 3rd Parachute Regiment was torn apart. Paratroopers dropped directly into the interlocking fields of fire of Greek machine gun positions. Cretan civilians, farmers, shepherds, old men, women, joined the fighting with a fury that shocked the Germans to their core. They attacked landing paratroopers with knives, hoes, shovels, and ancient hunting rifles. This was a cultural shock the Germans had not prepared for. They had been taught that war was a matter between soldiers. They had not imagined that peaceful villagers could transform into savage fighters in the space of a heartbeat. The participation of Cretan civilians turned the battle into a bloody people's war that the German operational planners had never anticipated. At his headquarters in Athens, student received the first radio reports. Every message carried the same tone of desperation: battalion commander killed. Unit surrounded immediately upon landing. Casualty rate 50%. Student's face went white. He understood that his plan for a lightning victory had collapsed. Instead of a walkover, he had thrown 22,000 men into an enormous meat grinder and the machine was running at full speed. But student could not stop. He had gone too far. If he halted now, the entire 7th Division would be annihilated. He had only one option remaining: pour more men into the furnace and hope that mass would eventually overwhelm the quality of the defense. He ordered his reserve units to prepare for takeoff. The second drop wave would go in that afternoon. Student was gambling everything on a bet whose price was measured in the lives of thousands of young men. The epicenter of the Crete tragedy was Maleme airfield. This was the key to the entire campaign. If the Germans captured the airfield, they could land transport aircraft carrying the 5th Mountain Brigade along with artillery and heavy mortars. If they failed, the entire airborne force would be isolated and destroyed. The 7th Airborne Division under Lieutenant General Wilhelm Suersmann was tasked with seizing Maleme. The lead assault unit was the Assault Parachute Regiment commanded by Colonel Eugen Meindl. Meindl jumped with his men and was seriously wounded almost immediately upon landing. He watched his battalion being torn to pieces around him. Major Scherber's 3rd Battalion was effectively wiped out. The 4th Battalion lost its commanding officer and most of its junior officers. German soldiers lay scattered through the vineyards, pinned down by machine gun fire pouring from Hill 107. Hill 107 was the tactical key to everything. This elevated position dominated the entire airfield and runway below. Colonel Andrew of New Zealand held the hill with 2 infantry companies and artillery support. From the high ground his soldiers could shoot at anything that moved on the airfield with the leisure of men at a rifle range. However, in the chaos and confusion of the battle, a psychological factor intervened that changed the course of the entire campaign. Colonel Andrew, despite holding the dominant position, lost communication with his forward units. He could not see the full picture of the battle. Smoke and dust obscured his view. He heard intense firing from multiple directions and concluded that German forces were overrunning his defensive positions. The reality was precisely the opposite. The Germans were dying in heaps. But the ferocity and recklessness of the surviving paratroopers, men who had gathered into small groups and were attacking with desperate aggression in every direction, created the illusion of a force far larger than it actually was. On the night of May 28, Andrew made a fateful decision. He ordered his troops to withdraw from Hill 107 and consolidate on a rear defensive line. He believed he was saving his force from encirclement. The decision was a catastrophic error. When the New Zealanders pulled back through the darkness, they abandoned the key to the island of Crete. On the morning of May 21, German paratroopers noticed with disbelief that the fire from Hill 107 had gone silent. They climbed cautiously up the slopes and found the trenches empty. They seized the high ground immediately and turned the captured machine guns eastward against the retreating Allied forces. Maleme airfield now lay under German fire control. Student in Athens received this report and could scarcely believe it. A flash of hope cut through what had been unbroken despair. He immediately ordered Ju-52 transports loaded with the 5th Mountain Brigade into the air. But landing at Maleme remained an act of something close to suicide. The runway was still within range of British artillery firing from further east. Wreckage from the previous day's fighting, burned aircraft, scattered equipment. The bodies of dead paratroopers lay strewn across the landing strip. The first Ju-52s came in through a curtain of fire. Several crashed into the wreckage of destroyed aircraft already on the runway and exploded. Others took artillery hits the moment their wheels touched ground. But Student accepted the sacrifice of aircraft to get men onto the island. For every transport destroyed, another came screaming in behind it. Mountain troops leapt from aircraft that were still rolling, running and firing before their boots had fully left the fuselage door. The insane determination of the Germans combined with the tactical error of the British withdrawal transformed Maleme from a death trap into a functioning beachhead. The killing process began to reverse. The Germans who had been hunted now possessed heavy weapons, ammunition, and growing numerical strength. They began organizing systematic attacks, pushing the Allied forces steadily eastward. The key to the island had changed hands, not because of German superiority but because of a single decision made in the fog of war by a good officer who could not see clearly enough to understand that he was already winning. While the land battle hung in the balance, another drama was unfolding at sea, equally savage and equally costly. Student understood that his paratroopers could not fight indefinitely without heavy equipment such as tanks and large-caliber artillery. He had assembled a makeshift flotilla of requisitioned Greek fishing boats and small coastal vessels to carry reinforcements and heavy supplies from the mainland to the island. But the Royal Navy had no intention of allowing that to happen. On the night of May 21, Admiral Cunningham's Mediterranean fleet detected the first German transport convoy. British cruisers and destroyers charged in like wolves on a wounded flock. The German convoy, protected by nothing more than a single Italian torpedo boat, was utterly defenseless. British warships switched on their searchlights, illuminating each fragile wooden fishing boat wallowing in the swell. Then they opened fire. Shells of 152 mm and 120 mm tore the wooden vessels apart. Ships sank. Men drowned. Equipment disappeared beneath the waves. More than 300 German soldiers were killed. The convoy was annihilated completely. Student received the report and understood immediately that the sea route was sealed shut. His only remaining lifeline was the air bridge through Maleme. But the Germans held an ace of their own, the Luftwaffe. On the morning of May 22, hundreds of Stuka dive bombers and Ju-88 medium bombers launched from airfields across mainland Greece. Their target was the British fleet. The Royal Navy, which had ruled the sea surface unchallenged, now faced the most dangerous enemy a warship can encounter: mass dive bomber attack without adequate fighter cover. The battle between ships and aircraft was ferocious. The cruiser HMS Gloucester was sunk. The cruiser HMS Fiji followed her to the bottom. The destroyers HMS Kelly and HMS Kashmir were sent down in rapid succession. The Luftwaffe's dominance of the air forced the British fleet to withdraw southward to Alexandria in Egypt. The waters around Crete were temporarily abandoned. Although the Germans could not exploit this by sending seaborne reinforcements, they had no transports left to send. They had achieved something equally important. They had prevented the British from reinforcing the island garrison by sea. On Crete itself the situation for the Allies deteriorated steadily after the loss of Maleme. Freyberg recognized that he could no longer hold the island. German air power owned the sky completely. Any Allied movement during daylight hours was punished immediately by bombs and strafing runs. German forces receiving continuous reinforcement through Maleme began compressing the British perimeter, driving the defenders southward across the island toward the small port of Sfakia on the southern coast. The retreat across the White Mountains was an ordeal of suffering. British, Australian and New Zealand soldiers stumbled along mountain paths without water and without food, harassed constantly by German mountain troops pressing close behind them. Many collapsed from exhaustion and were left where they fell. On May 27 the capital Hanyar fell. The Allied evacuation began. The Royal Navy, despite its crippling losses, returned to Cretan waters to pull soldiers off the beaches. They rescued approximately 16,000 men but were forced to leave more than 12,000 behind as prisoners of war. The campaign officially ended on June 1. The German flag flew over all of Crete. But there was no celebration. The atmosphere on the island was heavy with grief and the particular bitterness that accompanies a victory purchased at a price no one had been prepared to pay. In the days that followed, German paratroopers carried out brutal reprisals against Cretan civilians in retaliation for their participation in the fighting. At the villages of Kontomari and Kandanos, German soldiers executed hundreds of unarmed men. These were among the first war crimes committed by the Wehrmacht in southern and western Europe, a dark foreshadowing of the far greater atrocities that would follow in Russia. Student flew to Crete to inspect the battlefield. When he saw the enormous field cemeteries that had sprung up around Maleme airfield, row after row after row of fresh wooden crosses, he wept openly. The numbers told the story with a cruelty that no rhetoric could conceal. More than 4,000 German soldiers were dead. More than 2,000 were missing or severely wounded. Total casualties approached 7,000 men, nearly one-third of the force committed to the invasion. The 7th Airborne Division, Germany's elite paratroop formation, had been structurally wrecked. A devastating proportion of its experienced officers and non-commissioned leaders had been killed in the first days. When Student reported the results to Hitler, the Führer did not react with admiration. He reacted with fury. Instead of praising the victory, he spoke a sentence that effectively killed the future of German airborne warfare: Crete has shown that the day of the paratrooper is over. The paratrooper's weapon is surprise. And the element of surprise is gone. From that point forward, Hitler permanently forbade large-scale airborne operations. The German paratroopers, the Green Devils, the Blue Eagles, the men Student had imagined as the spearhead of a new form of warfare, were increasingly used as ordinary infantry, fighting and dying on the ground like any other soldiers. They remained formidable troops, often among the toughest formations in the German order of battle. But their wings had been cut off. Student's Icarus dream had collapsed. He had taken the island. But in doing so he had sacrificed the future of the very army he had spent his life creating. Yet the irony at the heart of Crete is one of the most bitter in military history. While the Germans buried their dead and abandoned the dream of airborne conquest, the Allies drew precisely the opposite conclusion. They did not look at Crete and see a failure of the airborne concept. They saw proof of its enormous potential. They concluded that if Germany had gone in with better planning, more accurate intelligence, and improved equipment, the victory might have come faster and at lower cost. Winston Churchill, after reading the reports, ordered the creation of Britain's 1st Airborne Division. The United States followed rapidly, raising the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions. The destruction at Crete exposed technical flaws that the Allies became determined to correct. First there was the weapons problem. German paratroopers had jumped carrying almost no firepower. Allied airborne doctrine changed this immediately. They designed methods for paratroopers to jump with weapons attached to the body or in accessible leg and chest bags so they could fight the instant they landed. Second, there was the aircraft problem. The German Ju-52 dropped men slowly through side doors, making them vulnerable and causing bottlenecks in the jump sequence. The American C-47 with dual doors enabled faster and safer exits. Third, there was the glider problem. The DFS-230 used by the Germans was too small and limited. The Allies developed larger gliders such as the Horsa and Waker, capable of carrying jeeps, anti-tank guns and much heavier equipment directly onto landing zones. In one of history's great strategic ironies, the disaster that crippled German airborne power effectively gave birth to the Allied airborne arm that would later play a decisive role in Normandy in 1944. Student had unintentionally taught his enemies how to use the weapon he himself had invented, and that weapon would eventually help destroy the Reich. Today Crete is known to most of the world as a place of beaches, mountains, and ancient ruins. But to veterans and to their families it remains sacred ground marked by pain. The German war cemetery at Maleme lies on a hill overlooking the airfield. More than 4,000 graves rest in silence beneath the cypress trees. The stone markers record names, dates of birth, dates of death. Most of those dates stop at age 20. Nearby lies the Allied cemetery at Suda Bay, where white headstones face the sea, beneath which many of their comrades still remain. The silence in these places is not peace. It is the echo of a lost generation. Kurt Student survived the war but was convicted of war crimes for the atrocities committed against Cretan civilians under his command. He was released early on health grounds and died in 1978. He never freed himself from the burden of responsibility for the thousands of paratroopers who died under his orders. In his final years he often said that Crete was the grave of the German airborne. But perhaps it was also the grave of innocence about war itself. The young men who jumped from that blue Mediterranean sky carried with them an absolute faith in glory and fatherland. They died before they could understand that they were nothing more than expendable pieces in a ruthless political game. Operation Mercury at Crete stands forever as a warning about the price of victory. In military science there is a term called a Pyrrhic victory, a victory that inflicts such devastating losses on the winner that it is functionally indistinguishable from defeat. Crete is the perfect definition of that term. The greatest lesson of Crete is not about tactics or weapons technology. It is about the balance between risk and reward. Kurt Student wagered too heavily on a strategic objective that was not worth the cost of taking it. He sacrificed the most elite force in the German military to capture an island that would prove strategically irrelevant once the war shifted to North Africa and Russia. Crete also demonstrates that no technological innovation, no matter how revolutionary, can replace the fundamental principles of warfare, logistics, intelligence, and coordination. German paratroopers could have been the bravest men on earth, and it would not have mattered if they jumped without adequate weapons and without accurate information about the enemy waiting below. The campaign further proved the enduring power of intelligence in warfare. The British ultra-decrypts gave Freyberg an advantage that no amount of German courage could overcome. He knew the enemy's plan before the first aircraft left the runway. In every era of warfare the side that sees more clearly wins more often, and at Crete the British saw everything while the Germans saw almost nothing. And yet the British still lost the island, a reminder that knowing what the enemy will do is not the same as having the means to stop it. Freyberg had the intelligence but lacked sufficient air cover, lacked adequate communications equipment, and critically lacked the confidence to trust what his own eyes were telling him about the state of the battle at Maleme. Information without the tools to act on it is just paper. Student dreamed of flying to the sun like Icarus on wings of wax. He forgot how the myth ended. The wax melted and the young man fell into the sea. At Crete the wax melted on the first day. The fall took another 11 days. And the sea that swallowed the dream was stained red with the blood of an entire generation of Germany's finest young soldiers. When we look at the graves at Maleme today, we do not see only the cruelty of war. We see the fragility of dreams of conquest. We see the gap between what leaders imagine from headquarters and what soldiers experience on the ground. We see the eternal human tendency to believe that this time it will be different, that this new weapon, this new doctrine, this new idea will change everything, and the equally eternal discovery that the old rules of war, written in blood across thousands of years of human conflict, have not changed at all. The silence over those cemeteries is not the silence of peace. It is the silence of a question that has never been answered satisfactorily, whether any island, any city, any piece of ground on this earth is worth the price that was paid to take it. Thank you for listening to this combat dossier on the World War II Dossiers-Podcast. If the story of Operation Mercury and the tragedy of the German paratroopers at Crete gave you a new perspective on military history, please hit like and subscribe to support our work. We are committed to bringing you the forgotten stories of history, not through the lens of triumphant victors but through the eyes of the defeated in the moment they realized that the price of glory is sometimes too high to bear. Where are you watching from today? And do you know of other costly victories from military history that changed the course of a war? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your engagement is what drives us to keep exploring the secrets of the past. We will see you in the next story, about the people, the machines, and the moments that shaped the world we live in today.